Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is John Moss. I'm on the staff of the National Museum of the U.S. Army, located at Fort Belvoir. We are currently closed due to COVID conditions, but hopefully you all, if you haven't seen us open yet, we will welcome you here and hope to have you back, be able to have you in the museum very soon. So this is the fourth installment of one of our virtual programs. It is we have a series of book talks, and tonight we're very happy to have with us Mark Maloy, who has come out with a new book, Victory or Death, The Battles of Trenton and Princeton, December 25th, 1776 through January 3rd, 1777. Good evening, Mark.
Hey, good evening.
All right, glad to have you with us. If you, we're going to give a little bit of information here about the book that's coming up here, and I'll hold it up here. I have my copy, and read it, enjoyed it. And Mark, tell us a little bit about yourself. You're in the history business and the National Park Service. What do you do for the Park Service?
I've worked for the Park Service now for over 10 years at numerous sites all up and down the eastern seaboard, South Carolina, Virginia, D.C., and I've always been really, really interested in historic sites and being in the place where history happens. Growing up, I grew up not far from actually where the museum is, and I was lucky enough to be able to visit while you guys were open for a little bit. So I really appreciate you all inviting me to speak here. But growing up in this area, Northern Virginia, I was able to go visit places like George Washington's Mount Vernon and other historic sites, and really fell in love with the stories, and being in the place where history happens is so important to me that I wanted to really commit my life to telling stories at the places where they happened. And so that led me to work for the National Park Service. But there are a lot of significant sites that aren't preserved by, the National Park Service that are nationally important. And the Trenton and Princeton are a perfect example. There are no national parks that preserve those places. But as we'll talk tonight, I'm sure, I think you'll find that it's nationally significant, and so I'm working now with some friends. We started a group called Emerging Revolutionary War, and you can check us out at emergingrevolutionarywar.org. And we go around and it's a blog. We try to tell stories from the Revolutionary War for the public, and also to bring to light many of these stories that often aren't told. So,
So this is the one of several in the series Emerging Revolutionary War. There are some other titles, right?
Yeah, so there are two other books in the series right now, and more coming along. There's a book about Lexington and Concord called A Single Blow, and a book about the Battle of Monmouth called A Handsome Flogging. And the guys and gals in Emerging Revolutionary War are working on other projects coming up, and we're based off of our sister organization, Emerging Civil War. Some of you may be familiar with them. They're also, the whole point of these organizations is really to present this information for a broad audience, people who don't want to read a 300-page tome about all the little tiny details, but kind of get a good idea of what happened. Sure. And another part of these books really is about taking you to the places where they happen. So in my book, I would say about a third of it is images and directions of where these places, where the things happened on the ground, and where you can go see them today.
Okay, good. Well, let's talk about the book. This was one of George Washington's clear victories during the war. I think we have a slide of George Washington. We'll flip over to that for a few seconds. But can you give us a sense of the strategic situation at the end of 1776 with Washington retreating across New Jersey and kind of fill us in on the background?
Yeah, no. I think that the end of 1776 is really one of the most dire situations the United States has ever found itself in the entire history of the country. We usually think of 1776 as a happy year, something to celebrate. The signing of the Declaration of Independence in July of 76. So it's usually this celebratory time, and it was at that time because George Washington, as you see pictured there, he was kind of a hero at that moment. He had driven the British out of the city of Boston in March. An American army down in Charleston, South Carolina, actually drove off the British from trying to invade down there. America declares its independence. Well, Great Britain wasn't about to let their colonies go that easily. So they're going to actually launch the largest military expedition force they had ever sent anywhere in the world up to that point. They're going to send that to New York City to try and end this rebellion that was going on. And so Washington is going to have to find a way to try and defend the city of New York. And if you just look at a map of New York, it's filled with islands and things. And the British had the best navy in the world at that point. And they're going to send an invasion force of 32,000 men and sailors. And they're going to go in there to really crush the rebellion. And Washington's going to try and put up a fight there in August and September of 1776. And he's really going to get really badly cut up. His army is beaten at Long Island. They're beaten on Manhattan. They're beaten up at Harlem Heights. They're going to be pushed across the Hudson River. They're going to end up getting driven all the way across the state of New Jersey. His army, Washington's army, goes from about 25,000 men, and it's just going to start bleeding men from either being killed or wounded, but then also dying of disease. But a large part of it was desertions. Men were just leaving because they thought that this whole cause of an independent United States was a lost cause. And as they're going across New Jersey, Washington at one point says he only has about 3,000 men left, 25,000. And Washington's going to eventually be able to get his army across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania in December of 76. And at that point, Washington's writing back to his brother saying he thinks the game's pretty near up. Congress evacuates Philadelphia, and they go on the run thinking that Philadelphia is going to fall. They actually give Washington almost dictator-like powers to go ahead and raise a new army. And it's really, a dire situation. There's a young author who's traveling with Washington's men across New Jersey and seeing this happen. And he writes a pamphlet that's published that month called The American Crisis. And that author was Thomas Paine, who had written Common Sense. And Thomas Paine says, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier, the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of his country, but he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." He says, "Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered, but they have the consolation that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph." Just amazing words that still inspire people when you read them today. But it really shows you how dark it was, and that this small band of, like I said, it was probably only about 3,000 men who were still effective soldiers in Washington's army at this point. They were sticking it out with Washington, and they do up to this point. But it looks pretty bleak, and it looks like the whole revolution might end if Washington and this army is destroyed or ceases to exist. It's going to be much easier for the British to force the colonists to submit.
So, who were the key British and American commanders during this campaign? We've already talked about George Washington, but can you fill us in a little bit about who else were the main leaders?
Yeah, so, on the American side, Washington, this is going to be his campaign. He's going to take center stage throughout most of this. He does have some loyal lieutenants who are going to serve well in the coming campaign and actually rise to quite large prominence later on in the war. Nathaniel Greene is by his side, who really emerges later in the war as really second to Washington. He has his artillery chief, Henry Knox. John Sullivan's one of his main generals who's going to help lead a division in the battles that come up. So he has a loyal group of men behind him, but he also has some soldiers or some generals in his army who actually think that Washington is doing a pretty poor job of trying to defend the United States. You have men like Horatio Gates, who is going to join Washington's army, but then he's going to actually leave on sick leave, and he actually heads to where Congress is, probably to lobby for Washington's position after his army dissolves. And then you have probably one of the most brilliant military minds on the American side was General Charles Lee, who actually Washington's trying to get him and his detachment to come join him, on the south side of the Delaware River. And Charles Lee is just kind of hanging out. Charles Lee does not think very highly of Washington. Some say he said, Washington wasn't fit to command a sergeant's guard. But Charles Lee actually ends up getting captured by the British. And John Sullivan, his second in command, is going to take his men and end up having them join with the American army. But so that's on the American side. On the British side, the commander is General William Howe, who actually, contrary, to how we generally think of the British, actually viewed this more as a civil war and wanted the war to kind of end peacefully, so that, realizing that they would be trading and they would still be friends with the Americans, and wanted to kind of end it, on good terms. But he's going to be the commander in chief, and he's really in charge of the whole operation. It's one of his generals who's going to feature prominently in the campaigns, Charles Cornwallis. Most people remember Cornwallis from Yorktown years later, but he's going to play an important role here. And the commander is going to be positioned really at the tip of the British Army at Trenton in 1776 is Colonel Johann Rall, who is a German Hessian commander of some German troops that are going to be stationed there at Trenton in 1776 to kind of look after what looks to be a dissolving army on the other side of the river.
So tell us about the Hessians a little bit. Who were they, and what were they doing in Trenton, New Jersey, on Christmas in 1776?
Yeah, so the Hessians are, they're often easily maligned a group of people, and they're often misunderstood. We commonly refer to them as mercenaries, but they weren't really mercenaries in kind of the way, you typically think of mercenaries. Germany at that time was not a unified country, so you had all these little principalities, what is today Germany. And Europe was almost in a constant state of warfare, so a lot of these princes would have these armies that they would essentially rent out to the leaders of other countries to fight in their wars. And it became a big industry. Now the men who end up serving in these Hessian regiments, a lot of times, that was their main business. So they would join the army, but they were loyal to their prince, and they were, the more accurate term for them were they were auxiliaries. So, King George III, is part of the Hanover line. They're, they have German bloodlines. His wife is, German. So it made sense that they would actually hire some German troops to come over. Now, the term Hessian comes from a lot of these soldiers come from Hesse Castle, that principality, actually a majority of them. And in fact, all of them at Trenton were from Hesse Castle. So when they came over, they were frequently referred to as Hessians. But you also had people from Brunswick. You had all these other principalities. But so there are different terms for them. They're all German auxiliaries, but they kind of just get lumped together in America and called Hessians. And when they come over here, the Americans are terrified of them. These guys with these, they have the big gold mitre hats, and they spoke a foreign language. They were, renowned for their military discipline. And they could be ferocious fighters. At the fighting around Brooklyn, New York, some of the American riflemen were found after the battle having been, skewered with bayonets and actually nailed to trees after the battle there. Of course, there was a lot of propaganda that went around saying that they were vicious, heartless killers. So The Americans were really terrified of the German Hessians, but a lot of the Hessians were kind of forced into this service, and when they came to America, and a lot of them find other Germans who had emigrated to America, a lot of them will end up staying over here. Almost like, I think it's like more than half of them end up staying here in the United States. So a lot of people, when you look at your actual history, a lot of people actually find that they have ancestors that were once Hessian soldiers that ended up staying here in the United States after the Revolution. So it's pretty interesting.
So by the end of December 1776, Washington had brought the small army that he had left across the river, the Delaware River, into Pennsylvania, and the British decided that they would occupy New Jersey, and that left Washington with something of a dilemma. He needed some kind of victory to shore up the whole cause of independence. So what did he decide to do?
Yeah. So as you said, the British kind of, after defeating all of the Washington's army up around New York and drive them across New Jersey, they leave behind all these little outposts across the state of New Jersey to kind of keep an eye on the Americans. And during this time, a lot of the Hessians and British are plundering the countryside, which really kind of angers the New Jersey people who are living there. And a lot of them are rising up and attacking their different supply lines and things like that. But you have these Hessians that are stationed there at Trenton, and Washington is in a very difficult position because the enlistments for those few thousand guys he has, the enlistments run out on January 1st, 1777. Most of them signed up for 1 year enlistments. As soon as those end, his army's going to dissolve. So yes, Washington has to act. He has to do something, otherwise his army's going to dissolve in front of his eyes. One of his aides says to do nothing is now equal to total defeat. So Washington sees that there's this outpost of Hessians at Trenton, New Jersey. And what he's going to do is make a plan to cross the Delaware River and do an offensive attack on the Hessians located there in Trenton. And Washington comes up with this plan, and it's actually a very detailed plan that he's going to have, he divides his army up into 3 different wings that are all going to cross the river at different points. And they're all going to converge on Trenton on the morning after Christmas, December 26, 1776. And yeah, like I said, Washington, it has his back against the wall. He actually makes the password for this whole operation Victory or Death, which is an apt name for it. Also a good name for a title of a book, as I found out. But he makes this the password to cross the Delaware and attack Trenton. Now, the day he chose was the day after Christmas. This is just the earliest day he could actually get his men together to do this attack. But it just so happens that a blizzard, or really a nor'easter, comes across the area, and it's going to be snowing and hailing and raining throughout the entire operation. The ice starts building up on the Delaware River. That the 2 lower crossings that were supposed to happen can't happen. So it's just going to be George Washington and about 2,400 men. They're going to cross the Delaware River up at McConkey's Ferry. And they're going to have to march 9 miles through this weather in the middle of the night to come down and attack the town of Trenton. And most of Washington's men, a lot of these guys, they don't have shoes. Their provisions are very low. The whole story of finding blood in the snow to follow the army. His officers are writing about how dire a situation this is, and Washington's going to persevere to do this. He's going to cross the Delaware, and he's going to push on. And the whole idea was to try and capture the Hessians before daylight. But because of the weather and everything else, the operation is slowed, and they're actually going to have to attack the Hessians in daylight and actually face them face to face.
All right, let's pull up the first map so we can kind of follow along with the story here. And this map is from your book, which I must say the maps are very, very good in this book and the other ones in this series. Very clear. So this is an example one of the maps in the book, but it's the first one. So we've got Washington crossing the Delaware River, and then at some point he and his men come upon a party of Hessians and another group of Continentals almost spoils the surprise. Was that part of the difficulty?
Yeah, absolutely. So, this whole operation was kind of based on secrecy. Washington was hoping the whole idea was to surprise the Hessians so that they wouldn't know that he was coming. And as you can see on that map, you'll see right at the bottom of the map, you'll see Ewing is supposed to be crossing right across from Trenton. And you'll see a little arrow at the very bottom saying Colonel Cadwalder is trying to cross down near Burlington. Those are the two other crossings that weren't able to happen. And it's actually a good thing because that might have alerted the Hessians ahead of time. But there was a group of American soldiers, some Virginians, who had crossed the Delaware the night before, and they had gone down and done a little raid on the Hessians. The Hessians responded to it, and then they went back to their quarters. And there had been, some stories that the Americans might be trying to do an attack. And so when that attack happened, they thought that was the whole attack, and they went back to their quarters, and they didn't think anything else was going to happen. So when Washington is marching down that Bear Tavern Road, as you see there, he sees some guys coming out, and they think it's the Hessians at first, and then they realize it's Virginians. Washington is furious. He says, you guys engaged them? Like, he thought like the whole surprise was over. But in reality, it probably actually helped them because, like I said, the Hessians were kind of on guard that something might happen. And then when, it turned out just to be a small raid, they thought that was the whole thing. And then they didn't realize the entire American army was coming down on them because there's only about 1,500 Hessians in Trenton. So they're going to be outnumbered almost 2-1 during this battle.
Okay, so before we get into the details of the tactical Battle of Trenton, or I should say the first Battle of Trenton, since there were, as you describe in your book, there were two of them. Tell us about what the Hessians were doing in Trenton on Christmas Day, and there's some myths about soldiers being unprepared and trying to spend the day getting over a hangover from Christmas celebrations. Can you tell us a little bit about what was going on inside the town and what the Hessians were doing?
Yeah, so that's the common story is that the Hessians were drinking, celebrating for Christmas, and that they were, caught totally off guard, and they were all hungover, and that's how Washington and his men were able to quickly steal this victory. But it turns out that's actually a myth. It was almost the opposite. Like I said, these guys were constantly on guard. The militias in the area, and then also some of the scouts from Washington's army were kind of constantly harassing them. And Rahl, who was in command of the troops there at Trenton, was being told by his superiors to be on the lookout just in case Washington's men tried to do an offensive, thinking that they might try to do something. And so they were really exhausted because they were constantly, replying to alarms and things like that. And the story of them being drunk, actually, it dates back to right after a battle happens, where the British are looking for some reason to explain how they, messed this up. And, Rahl and the Hessians made quite easy scapegoats where they kind of said, well, they were all drunk and they couldn't handle a defense there. But, veterans of the battle said later, to testified saying there was not a single drunk Hessian soldier that I saw when I was there. So.
Okay, let's pull up our second map, and we will use that to get Mark to tell us about the actual tactical details of the battle and what happened during the fighting. So here's this map is from the book. Excellent representation of the battle. But can you take us through the battle in general and what happened during the fighting?
Yeah, so like I said, the Hessians were definitely taken by surprise, but they were able to put up a defense. So their outposts get driven in, and as you can see, Washington had divided his army into two columns. John Sullivan was taking his column down along the River Road. Nathaniel Greene with George Washington was coming in from the Pennington Road at the top there. And as you can see also there, he sent across General Fermoy to try and pin them in from the Princeton Road as well. But they come into the town, and both sides hit almost at the exact same time, 8 a.m. So it's daylight, but it is, again, it's snowing and there's an awful storm happening. The Hessians try to put up a fight. They're driven back. The Americans, and again, it's because it's raining and snowing and everything and sleeting. The weapons they're using are flintlock muskets, so they usually don't operate that well in that kind of weather. So Americans, as soon as they're getting into the town, they're taking, there's a lot of street fighting, house to house fighting. If they get inside, they're using their dry powder from the inside and firing from the windows and doors of the buildings. The Hessians try to effect a defense in the streets, but as you can see at the very top there, they're going to put a bunch of cannons at the top of the town, and they're going to be Henry Knox and his artillery is going to be firing down the streets. It's going to really rattle the Hessian soldiers, and they're going to be driven from the town. And as you can see there on the map, there are two kind of counterattacks Rawls going to attempt. First, he tries to break through onto the Princeton Road, but they're driven back. And then he's going to try driving through and back into town. But they get really cornered into basically a three-cornered box, a three-sided box where they're getting fired on from all sides. Rawle himself is shot twice in the side and falls from his horse, and he's mortally wounded. He'll die the next day. And the other Hessians are driven out of the town into this little apple orchard, where eventually, after about 45 minutes, an hour of fighting, they're going to lay down their weapons and surrender. And this was, one of the first major victories for Washington and all army.
Now, one of the things that people will be interested in when they read the book is that there were actually 2 future U.S. presidents at the battle. One was Washington. Can you tell us about the other one and what happened to him?
Yeah, so there was a young 18-year-old James Monroe, who was a lieutenant in the 3rd Virginia Regiment. He actually had left his studies at the College of William and Mary and had joined the Army. He was with Washington's men. And at one point in the battle, the Hessians had recaptured their artillery in town. And James Monroe and Washington's cousin, William Washington, and a few other guys, they charged towards the Hessians to try and capture this artillery piece. And Monroe is struck in the shoulder by a musket ball. It actually severs an artery, and he almost bleeds out right there on a street there in Trenton. But luckily, a doctor is going to clamp his artery and save his life. And Monroe will go on to become, the 5th president of the United States. But if you ever look at probably the most famous image of this whole campaign is Washington crossing the Delaware. And if you look closely at that image, you'll actually see James Monroe, the artist, put him in there right behind Washington, holding up the American flag there. So
great. Okay, we have actually an Army image of the Battle of Trenton, which we'll pull up right now. That kind of gives a feel for the nature of the street fighting, and kind of some of the battle that was going on here. This one you're familiar with, Mark, I'm sure. But what does this one depict? Is this at the beginning of the attack, or?
This is a part of that attack. At the beginning, Rawle. This is on King Street there in King Street right there in Trenton, where near Rawle's headquarters. They're going to pull up their artillery to fire on the Americans, and they're only able to get a few shots off before, as you can see, the Americans kind of come charging down the street, and they're able to capture the artillery piece. And this painting is great. Yeah, I used it for the cover of the book. It's by Charles McBarron. And for the Army during the bicentennial, they painted it. It's a good image to kind of show you that street fighting. You see in the distance too how the guys are using stone walls and all sorts of cover they can use to fire from. one participant said, because they were relying on bayonets and sort of hand-to-hand combat to try and win this battle. But only a few of the Americans actually had, because of their provisions, only had bayonets. So it was pretty dicey. But you can see there on the right side too, Colonel Rawl lying there, having just been shot from his horse. So it's pretty good image of the fighting that took place there at Trenton.
So our next image is a modern one, and can you tell us what this image and perspective is showing?
Yeah, so this is, and like I said, that's kind of what this book is for. It's for I just told you a pretty fascinating story of the fighting there. Well, this is the battlefield today. So unlike places like Gettysburg or other places that's kind of been cordoned off and preserved and are places for people to go visit, this is what the battlefield looks like today. So a lot of the streets of modern day Trenton follow the same street pattern from the 18th century. So this is King Street there. Today, I think it's called Warren Street. And it was here, you can see in the distance, that big tall monument. That's where Washington and his artillery were firing down the streets at the top of town. And it was right about in this area where Rawls' artillery was. And this is about what that same image looks like today. So this is James Monroe was almost killed. I would say, very hallowed ground that people probably drive over every day, don't even realize how significant it is. There is no, plaque. There's no historic marker at this location. But this was where some of the heaviest combat happened in the Battle of Trenton. That's often forgotten. So when you get the book, it kind of tells you the GPS coordinates, so you can actually go there and see where this happens.
Good. One more image we'll show. This one is from 1914. An image of Washington inspecting the captured colors, and really it shows how kind of legendary the battle grew after the Revolution, after the Civil War, and when people look back to one of if the Washington's greatest triumphs other than Yorktown. Just a quick image there. Now let's move to the second battle, Mark. I think a lot of folks probably don't know that there was another engagement the next day, or was it 2 days later?
It was almost a week after.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so what happens is, so in the combat at Trenton, Washington, the Americans kill or capture, they kill or wound about 100 Hessians, and about 900 are captured. Washington's going to send the Hessian prisoners down to Philadelphia, and they'll end up at different POW camps. And then Washington actually takes his army, and they quickly recross the Delaware. And then Washington's waiting around trying to figure out what he should do, and then ends up recrossing the Delaware back to Trenton, and ends up setting up like kind of a defensive position in the city of Trenton. Meanwhile, the British are outraged over what happened. They cannot believe that, Rawl had been taken by surprise. They cannot believe they had lost, Trenton and this large outpost and all these Hessians. In Cornwallis, General Cornwallis of the British Army was actually to go life and tell King George about their wonderful campaign and how they had almost destroyed Washington's army. And, he immediately cancels his leave. Cornwallis gathers up. They're gathering up pretty much every British soldier they can in the New York area, and they immediately start marching down to Washington's army down at Trenton. And that's when, in January 2nd, the Second Battle of Trenton, also called the Battle of Assunpink Creek, that Washington's going to eventually try to slow this British advance on his army and fight them on the banks of the Assunpink Creek on January 2nd, 1777.
Got it. So, but Washington wasn't quite done yet as far as going on the offensive. He had to convince a bunch of his men to stay on another couple of weeks or 3 weeks, and he decided, based on intelligence, that there was another British outpost at Princeton that was vulnerable. Can you tell us about that? Let's bring up, I think we have a map on the, Washington's march to Princeton. There you go. So
Yeah.
tell us why he was attacking Princeton and what did he hope to achieve?
Yeah. So yeah, you can see from this map, Cornwallis's army on the 2nd of January, 1777. They were marching down that Princeton road from Princeton down to Trenton, and they fight all day along the way. And then Washington, as you can see at the bottom there, is his men are all along the Assunpink Creek, which is just south of Trenton. And all along, and once Cornwallis gets there in the evening of January 2nd, he launches a bunch of attacks against Washington's position. And Washington repulses all the attacks, but Cornwallis was kind of just sending his guys in there piecemeal, and they were all repulsed. And then Cornwallis says, all right, stop all the attacks. And Cornwallis famously quips, we'll bag the old fox in the morning. So Cornwallis's army is being, brought up to get ready to assault Washington's position early in the morning of January 3rd, 1777. Now, Washington on that night has one of the most difficult decisions he has to make probably in his entire career as a general. Mm-hmm. He's sitting there on the south side of the Assunpink Creek. He has a couple options. One, he could retreat south towards Philadelphia. If he does that, the whole victory at Trenton looks like a fluke, and he could lose, the morale of his men that had just won these great victories. He could stand and try and fight Cornwallis, but where his position is there on the Assunpink Creek, if Cornwallis was able to penetrate his lines, if he was able to flank him, Washington and pretty much his whole army probably would have been crushed there with the Delaware River right to their back. And then Washington has this other idea, and that is to try and flank Cornwallis's army in the middle of the night. Now, this is a risky move, but there's a small group, and you can see up there at Princeton, a rear guard of about 1,500 British soldiers that are up there under the command of Colonel Mahood. And Washington decides what he's going to do is move his whole army and march around that flank in the middle of the night. So around midnight, he's going to disengage, which, I mean, this is, such a bold move in the face of the main British army. If they caught him at any point during this movement, they would have been destroyed. But Washington's going to leave just a handful of guys back to basically build up campfires. And then he's going to march overnight, starting at midnight, march around the British flank, as you see there, and come up to try and attack, pretty much in the same similar fashion as he did at Trenton, attack the British rear guard there at Princeton. But when he gets up there to Princeton, he gets there right at sunrise, January 3rd, 1777. He finds that the British there are actually already on the move. They're headed down to join Cornwallis and join in the big attack at Assunpink Creek. And that's when the Battle of Princeton is going to break out between Washington and this small rear guard. And when Cornwallis wakes up on the morning of January 3rd, 1777, they hear the cannons 12 miles away back at Princeton, fighting going on. He's immediately going to try and get his guys up there, but it's going to be too late.
Okay, let's bring up the battle map of the Battle of Princeton. Again, another map from your book. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened as far as Washington? Washington was on the offensive. It was a confusing affair, and he wound up leading one of the charges. Is that right?
Yep, yeah. I would consider this probably one of Washington's finest moments as a military commander, because the whole thing looks like it might end in disaster. What happens is, as you can see there, you can see Sullivan's column is at the head of Washington's army. They're marching up towards the town of Princeton. You can see at the same time that the British are marching down the other road towards Trenton. Both sides glimpse each other from about a mile distant. And the British immediately turn around, they run back, and then they start marching to try to intercept the Americans. Washington sends a small brigade, a friend of his actually, General Hugh Mercer, and about 300 Virginians, Pennsylvanians, and Marylanders to try and stop the British. And the main regiment the British is going to be fighting with is the 17th Regiment of Foot. And the two meet in these fields south of the town of Princeton. And Mercer's guys, they just get overrun. Mercer himself is shot from his horse, and he tries to put up a fight against the British when his sword is knocked out, and he gets bayoneted 7 times and will eventually die from those. But the 350 Americans get overrun, and those guys start falling back into the other people, the other soldiers in Washington's column, and mass panic kind of breaks out. And it's at this moment that it looks like this small group of British soldiers is going to be able to, cut into Washington's main army. And that's when Washington himself rides into the thick of battle, starts rallying the troops. He cries out, "Parade with me, my brave fellows. There's but a handful of the enemy, and we shall have them directly." So he gathers whatever troops he has on hand, and they're going to launch a counterattack. One of the Pennsylvania soldiers who sees him riding up and down the line says, "When I saw him brave all the dangers of the field, his important life hanging as it were by a single hair, with 1,000 deaths flying around him, believe me, I thought not of myself." And one of Washington's good aides, Colonel John Fitzgerald, who's actually from Alexandria here, he actually says he sees Washington ride up, order the men to reform. He marches them forward, rides in between the American and British lines. They say he's 30 yards from the British line. And at that moment, both armies level their muskets and they all open fire at the same time. Fitzgerald says he covers his eyes with his hat, saying he didn't want to see Washington cut down in front of him. When the smoke clears, there's Washington completely unscathed. And he yells, "Away, my dear Colonel, and bring up the troops. It's a fine day for a fox hunt." And the Americans charge forward, and they totally outnumber the British here. And the British put up a good fight, but they're driven from the field, and Washington basically saves the day. And then the Americans, immediately go up and they're going to capture whatever British are left up near where the college is today at Nassau Hall. And there's a famous story of a young Alexander Hamilton who fought the Battle of Trenton. He crossed the Delaware with Washington, and Alexander Hamilton fires a cannon shot through Nassau Hall that supposedly decapitates a painting of King George II that was hanging in there. Probably apocryphal, but still a good story. And that print you're bringing up there right now, this moment of Washington rallying the troops there at Princeton is one of those moments that becomes a defining moment in Washington's life. It really solidifies a bond with the men who he is fighting with, and really, I think, personifies the whole idea of leading from the front. Totally doesn't care about the harm that he's putting himself in, and ends up saving the day for the American army.
Well, Washington never received a college education, but he did go to Princeton for a short period of time and did pretty well there, didn't he?
Yeah.
So what did the Army... I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I assume you're going to ask what the Army did after that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so he doesn't stay long in Princeton. So as I said, during the battle, like I said, Cornwallis had heard it, and he's marching his 7,000 troops up the road to try and capture Washington. And like I said, Washington doesn't stick around. There is some Washington could have tried to press his luck and try to attack another British outpost up near what's today New Brunswick, New Jersey. But instead, he ends up just moving his army into winter quarters up in Morristown, New Jersey. Now he goes up to Morristown. It's in the mountains, so it's a little easier to defend his position up there. And by the time Washington leaves Princeton, that's when Cornwallis gets up there, and it's too late. From his position up there in Morristown, Washington basically sits astride the British supply lines of their whole outpost. So just really where he's positioned forces the British to fall back almost all the way back to New York City. And, from his, the New Jersey militia is going to rise up after, seeing these victories. And Washington's going to continually have this, they call it the Forage War, that's going to go on for the winter months of 1777, where they're attacking supply lines and outposts and everything like that. So, like I said, the British are forced all the way back to New York City. So here you have, the largest expeditionary force Great Britain had sent anywhere in the world. They had, fought and won all these victories, but what do they have to show for it after 6 months of campaigning? Just the city of New York. everything else had been reclaimed by Washington and the
Mhm.
Americans.
So let me take this opportunity to make sure folks know if they have any questions, they can put them in the chat. While we're still on Princeton here, Mark, one of the questions is about the story that the British held out in Nassau Hall, believing that the Americans would not fire on it, and Hamilton's comment after firing was that he was not a Princeton man. Have you heard that story before?
Actually, I haven't heard that story. I know, Hamilton obviously didn't go to Princeton, but or was then to college in New Jersey. But yeah, I haven't heard that story. But like I said, I think a lot of those stories have been exaggerated. But yeah, no doubt though, Hamilton was there, and they do surround some members of the 40th Regiment of Foot that hold up in there. And yeah, I believe they thought they could, but they didn't put up a much of a fight because after a few cannon shots, they're gonna basically put out a white flag and surrender to the Americans.
So, Mark, recently, and I say recently, I mean maybe the last 10 to 20 years, this campaign from Trenton, maybe from the crossing through Princeton, has been called the 10 Crucial Days for the American cause. Was this a turning point in the war, do you feel? And what does that really mean for a military historian to identify a battle or a campaign as a turning point? What do you think?
I mean, yeah, it's interesting because when you talk to a lot of Revolutionary War historians, what's the turning point in the war, and people will identify different things. You often hear Saratoga, the battles at Saratoga being a turning point because that would help get the French in. Of course, Yorktown is a turning point because even though Cornwallis's large army that surrenders there, and it's really I think turning points are often historians making arguments for what they think are the most significant or events of, and a lot of it includes kind of counterfactual history. What if this didn't happen? And I think I think Trenton and Princeton, like he said, it's called the 10 Crucial Days because in just this 10 days, Washington kind of turned the tables, and you really see it right afterwards. People on both the British and the American sides are talking about just the American morale, how it went from so negative that this whole cause was over, to all of a sudden men joining up with the army, recruiting offices get filled, more and more people start joining on. I see it as a real turning point. I would argue that it's the turning point because the what if is if Washington and his army is crushed or defeated on the banks of the Delaware River. First of all, I think Washington is going to come as a huge. I don't think without Washington there's a United States of America because he's going to play such a significant role in ultimately giving up power and turning everything over. He's going to play significant roles in the Constitution and the first president of the United States. So, if Washington is destroyed, I think that the cause is lost. Now there are other armies. There's other commanders out there. So, technically the war could have continued on and other people could have put up with it. But I think as far as we know, I think that Trenton and Princeton turns out to be really the turning point. And you have many historians, many. There's a British historian who says that never in the history of the world had so few men in such a short amount of time had such lasting impacts on the history. You have Frederick the Great, who even comments and says how brilliant this campaign was. It's just like the amount of praise it gets from numerous people to see how dire the situation was and how everything was kind of turned around. I think really gives credence to the fact that these really were the 10 crucial days of the war and really turned everything around for the American cause.
Okay, let me get a couple questions in here from our viewers / listeners, our audience. What do you think about the John Honeyman spy story? Some people think it's a myth. Some think it's real. What's your opinion? And just tell us a little bit about John Honeyman for those who don't know.
Yeah, so I think in popular narrative or on TV, I think the show Turn really kind of focuses a lot on these stories of spies, and Washington, sure enough, was really a spy master. Trying to use intelligence to find out as much information as he could. And yeah, one of the famous stories of spies surrounding the Trenton and Princeton campaign is the story of John Honeyman. And as far as its veracity, I mean, I think that the records are so unsure, and frankly, they were meant to be that way because oftentimes during this time period they weren't trying to divulge their true intentions. But the story of John Honeyman was that he was a patriot spy who was pretending to be a loyalist in the area, who happened to get captured by the Americans, and then he was able to go to Washington's headquarters and basically lay out all the dispositions of the Hessian army in Trenton, and kind of give him all this information so that he could be able to win the battle. And then, like I said, I think years later, some family members said, said this is what John Honeyman did, and whether he actually did or didn't, and I don't think we'll ever know how true a lot of those stories are. But
Sure.
I'm sure, like anybody trying to study, spies or intelligence and that thing, there's a reason why they're trying to cover up as much information as they can when they're doing it. So, but it's a great.
Another question: what did the Americans do with the Hessian prisoners after the battle?
Yeah, so like I said, they send them across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. Contingent marches them down to Philadelphia, where they actually marched through the streets. Because, like I said, there's kind of this propaganda of these guys being vicious murderers. And here, a lot of people have never seen these people before. So all these people in Philadelphia came out to watch them march through the streets. And then the officers, and in 18th century armies, officers and enlisted were treated very differently. So the enlisted, a lot of them are sent to prisoner of war camps. There's one out in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Some of them are going to be the officers actually sit down and dine with Washington a couple days after the battle. And then some of them are actually sent down here to Virginia, not far from the Museum of the Army in Dumfries, where they're going to spend a few months down there as well. And then, but basically, and then they're either going to be looked to exchange them, but the Americans are also trying to get them to come over and desert and join the American side. And as I mentioned earlier, where, many of them are going to find a lot of the German immigrants that had already settled here in the United States, they find this to be a favorable place. It's interesting because I didn't mention it earlier in the talk, but, when the Hessians are being forced to surrender out in the fields outside of Trenton, one of the regiments on the American side was composed almost entirely of Germans who were yelling at them in German to surrender their weapons. So it really kind of shows you the international aspects of the American Revolution. It wasn't just British and Americans.